I didn't know he didn't speak French because he says, yes, I speak French. I think it's very important for actors to lie in interviews because it does get you parts, you know. But just don't lie about you can swim when you can't, because that wouldn't be smart. But I mean, it was an innocuous little white lie. He said he spoke fluent French, and he gave me a line of dialogue in French. I was so impressed. And I loved him in Midnight Cowboy and some other things he had done. He'd always played these kind of quirky parts. And yet I wanted him to play against type and to play a cartographer who also speaks French and is inducted into the governmental ranks to be Truffaut's interpreter. And I also saw a kind of kinship between Truffaut and Balaban. And when I put Balaban's picture on my little casting board next to Truffaut's, they almost looked like French partners and soulmates.
Il s'agit d'un petit groupe de gens.
This is a small group of people
qui ont eu la même vision en même temps.
who have shared a vision in common.
Look.
My main reason for casting François, and it was a pipe dream. Everybody has their wish list. You know, you put the impossible dream at the top of the list and you work your way down to the more practical choices. And he was in the very top of my list. But mainly because I had seen him in Wild Child. And I felt he was such a tremendous human presence in that film. He just radiated so much compassion. And I felt that rather than putting the face of government on this movie, the face of bureaucracy on the characters that were on the government side, I wanted to put the image of government on all the vehicles and all the bureaucracy. But I wanted the face that led the way to be extremely charitable and kind and optimistic. And Truffaut came into my mind like a snap of a finger. And I remember calling him and getting him on the phone in Paris. And through his assistant who spoke English, he interpreted for us. I asked him if he would read my script that I had written myself. And he was impressed with the fact that I had written the script myself and I was going to direct it because he's written so many of his own scripts. And he said, yes, please send it to me, which was in English, by the way. And I sent him the script. And 3 days later, I got a telegram where he said, please send somebody over so I can talk about my wardrobe. That was sort of contained in the telegram. That was the way he said yes.
I remember being told one day that François Truffaut was going to play the part of the doctor. And the whole movie took a notch up, you know. Steven took a notch up. The studio took a notch up because he was so, and is so, extraordinary a figure. It said something amazing and reconfirming about our attitude of what Close Encounters was all about. If Close Encounters just a science fiction movie, François Truffaut never would have done that. But he also recognized the noble ambition of that film. That's why he said yes.
I think that François Truffaut, for the mass market audience in the United States, was not well known because French films in French have never had an easy time of it, and they're always art films, basically. But the large number of people who did know who he was were in awe of him, basically, as was everybody on the movie. I mean, Richard certainly was, Dreyfuss, and I know when they all met him, they all would come to me and say, you know, like, we're scared, you know, what's happening? I think, he's really nice, guys, you know, don't be afraid. He doesn't speak English, so he's going to seem kind of stern and nervous, but it's just because he doesn't speak, but he really likes you all. And I was kind of like translating back and forth.
He only thought and breathed and lived about films, Truffaut, and so that's everything that he talked about, the behavior on the set, what producers should and should not say to crew members, what this should happen, what that should. I mean, he had everything down in terms of movies, who did what.
I know François Truffaut went up to Steven in the beginning of the movie and made it very clear. He said, you know, I'm here to be an actor in this movie. I'm not a director. You just tell me what to do, sir, and I'll do anything you say. And it was completely like that during the movie.
He loved the idea of working for Steven. He was so happy to be there because he had made Jaws, and this was such a great, energetic movie, and he had such great things to say about everybody. And he was completely in love with the cinema and filmmaking. He's just completely soaked in it. That's what his life was all about. I remember I was in a when I was a dancer, in a very, very obscure movie called Red Line 7000. And I was telling him about it. He says, I know the movie. It was Howard Hawks' last movie. It had James Caan. It had so-and-so. It had he knew everybody in it. I was a singing waitress in it. I know the scene that you are in. It has a girl doing the fake French. It had He knew everything. He was steeped in it up to his eyeballs. I said, you know, don't you ever sleep, or do you just watch TV and movies all the time? I think that's what he did.
François Truffaut was already famous for his admiration of children. And I was no exception. I remember him being very affectionate, just very kind and very loving.
Some of the grown-ups on the set were frightened of him because of his stature, basically, but to kids he was like, you know, children have that ability to just look at somebody and tell if they're friendly and if they're kid-friendly, and they knew right away, and he was like the Pied Piper.
I'm not certain that 2001 inspired me more than that it intimidated me, because it was such a great movie. Of course, you know, one of the things that impressed me about 2001 were those amazing visual effects, and I got the list of everybody responsible for it, and of all the people whose names were credited, the one person who lived in Los Angeles was Doug Trouble. The rest of them were British. And Colin was in Los Angeles also. I remember Colin was one of the first people I ever met, Colin Cantwell. And Colin did the very, very first CGI test in history for Close Encounters, and actually on a computer generated 3 flying discs with lights flying across a football stadium, all computer generated. It might have been the first, for a movie, computer generated test ever done. And it was extraordinary, but it still wasn't up to both the artistry and the technology that the supercomputers at a much cheaper price were able to supply to Hollywood 15, 18 years later. So we were, I thought, really 18 years ahead of our time with Colin Cantwell and his opening tests. As Colin continued to dabble in the CGI world, Doug came on and just said, hey, look, let's get practical. We got to have to use models. And we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. We're going to do it in a different way. We're going to use motion control. I said, what's motion control? He said, that will allow you to pan and tilt and dolly and still lock the effects in the frame exactly where you want them. I said, really? He said, yeah. And that impressed me.
Historically in the movie business, it's been very hard to match the movement of the camera. So most often in any kind of a matte shot or composite shot of a foreground and background, the camera would be locked off. It simply wouldn't move. Then things would line up. Close Encounters was the first film ever to use a digital live-action recording system. We had what's called shaft encoders, which are a digital signal generating device on each handle of the camera as well as on the dolly track. Any motion that the camera made, including focus changes, were digitally recorded on a cassette tape. And then that tape could be loaded back into the computer and used to control the motion of the camera 1 frame at a time during miniature photography. You'd see a lot of shots where the camera's panning 180 degrees and François Truffaut walks out onto the threshold, and then there's 3 flying saucers hovering out there. Obviously those saucers were added later, but we were able to exactly match the motion of the camera. Every time you duplicate a piece of film, it degrades in quality. It gets more grainy, it gets more contrasty, and it loses quality. So since the bulk of this movie, Close Encounters, was being shot in 35mm anamorphic, if you shot the visual effects in 35 anamorphic and then duplicated them, the visual effect shots would be lower quality and you would see increased grain on every effect shot. You compensate for that by shooting in a larger format, 65mm in this case, which is almost triple the amount of film size. Stephen and Columbia were willing to shoot all the visual effects for Close Encounters in 65mm. So that we did all of our optical effects, all the matte paintings, miniatures, tank shots and stuff in 65, combined them optically in 65mm, made a final composite in 65mm, and then made a 1-step anamorphic reduction print from that.
It was a marvelous relationship actually between Doug and myself and Stephen. Many effects we didn't know how we were going to do. That's why we needed so many tests to shoot. And certain things worked, certain things didn't work. Things sometimes are so complicated that, you know, everything had to be sketched out. And we had, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of sketches.
I was looking for a really super fine illustrator. So I called Dale Hennessy, who was a production designer. And I had known Dale for years and respected his work as an illustrator. And I said, gee, who would you recommend? And he said, well, there's a guy I just used. And he's sort of new to the business. His name is George Jensen. George is, not only does he draw beautifully, he thinks in detail and has a great story. And so he contributed so much. Did a tremendous amount of storyboards. And just sketch after sketch. And when Stephen started to approve certain concepts, and George ended up doing them in color, which is sort of unusual. But trying to create that sort of light effect that Stephen was interested in. So the color really helped to contribute to which direction we were going to in the mothership and lighting the sets, and it was just invaluable. It was almost to the day that Jaws was released that they put me on Close Encounters. And it was just a small picture, and Stephen wanted to start looking for this strange bit of topography, you know, this pinnacle or whatever it was. So I started driving through the Badlands and the Devil's Tower, which was pretty amazing because I could see it off in the distance for like 25 miles. This actually, I believe, was the first national monument, but I had really never heard of it. And then I came back with photographs, and Stephen immediately said Devil's Tower was, you know, hands down the best visual look. And that was it. That was the beginning.